a bit tired now. This is Physics News 2016-04. No. Oh, sorry. It's from Tracy Regan, 6th of April, 2016. Now, the inspector of a geomagnetic solar storm with the ferocity to disrupt communications satellites, knock out GPS systems, shut down air travel, and quench lights, computers, and telephones in millions of homes for days, months, or even years, has yet to grip the public as a panic-inducing possibility. But it is a scenario that space scientists, global insurance corporations, and government agencies from the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, to NASA, to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, take seriously, calling it a low probability but high impact event that merits a substantial push on several fronts: research, forecasting, and mitigation strategy. Space weather experts gather at a recent conference in Washington, D.C. that drew space weather specialists from academia, the federal government, the military, and private industry. Louise Lanzarote, distinguished research professor at NJIT's Center for Solar Terrestrial Research, summed up the implications of a massive, well-timed solar storm for today's technology-based, hyper-connected global society. Since the development of the electrical telegraph in the 1840s, space weather processes have affected the design, implementation, and operation of many engineered systems. At first on Earth and now in space, noted Lanzarote, a panelist at the conference. As the complexity of such systems increases, as new technologies are invented and deployed, and as humans have ventured beyond Earth's surface, both human-built systems and humans themselves become more susceptible to the effects of Earth's space environment. In addition to disrupting communications and energy grids, what is broadly known as space weather, powerful bursts of electromagnetic radiation, energetic charged particles, and magnetized plasma, has the potential to corrode water and sewer pipelines, to erase historical data stored in computer memory, to undermine military and security operations, and to harm astronauts traveling in space. The symposium, Space Weather Science and Applications, Research for Today, Training for Tomorrow, sponsored by the University Space Research Association, USRA, and the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, focused on the growing urgency for both basic scientific research and the development of practical applications in the field. Once systems start to fail, the outages could cascade in ways we can't even conceive, said Daniel Baker, director of the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics at the University of Colorado Boulder, and also a panelist who recommends increasing support for the development of engineering systems and devices capable of protecting Earth's infrastructure. $1 trillion recovery. In a 2013 report, Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, put the population at risk of a massive storm at between 20 to 40 million, with durations up to 1 to 2 years, depending largely on the availability of spare replacement transformers. The cost of such recovery would range between $600 billion and $2.6 trillion. The symposium followed on the heels of a conference late last year, Space Weather: Understanding Potential Impacts and Building Resilience, convened in Washington, D.C., under the auspices of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, and also attended by scientists and engineers from academia and industry, as well as policymakers and elected officials. At that time, the OSTP laid out a multi-part action plan to address, as Lanzarote put it, civil societal issues related to all aspects of space weather. In an op-ed piece that followed, Lanzarote, who was also a panelist at that conference, called the federal plan impressive for its analysis and coverage of the measurements, data, and models that will be required to ensure security under space weather events of all types, from huge geomagnetic storm produced telluric currents initiated by coronal mass ejections to solar radio produced outages of GPS receivers to radiation effects by magnetosphere, solar, and galactic radiation to satellite drag effects from Earth's atmosphere and ionosphere. These areas are the focus of NGIT Center for Solar Terrestrial Research, which has a variety of instruments in space and on the ground for observing and recording space weather, including the world's largest solar optical telescope at Big Bear Solar Observatory, a solar radio telescope array in Owens Valley, instruments across Antarctica and abroad, spacecraft in the Van Allen radiation belts. At the recent symposium, Tamara Dickinson, the Principal Assistant Director for Environment and Energy at the OSTP, described recent minor storms that had caused disruption, a blackout in Sweden during which NASA also detected anomalies in deep space missions, and several years later, the interruption of flight control systems, again in Sweden, that halted air traffic. Setting benchmarks to assess risks to critical infrastructure. Dickinson said the government is at a fundamental turning point in its approach to space weather planning and prepared to take decisive action to address this risk. Ralph Stoffler, the Director of Weather, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at U.S. Air Force Headquarters in Washington, said the Air Force was currently expanding its network of sensors to monitor space weather, including placing them on all of its satellites. We need data to support particular military operations, Stoffler said, adding that the Air Force relies on GPS for missions such as piloting remote aircraft in Afghanistan from the U.S. If we can predict space weather, we can have other operations in place or delay. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has recently added space weather to its daily operations briefings. We know there is a gap in our ability to assess vulnerability and consequences, said Jack Anderson, a senior analyst at DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate, adding that while there is currently no scale for predicting the magnitude of a storm, as exists for hurricanes, for example, we need to develop that at FEMA. William LaPenta, Director of the National Centers for Environmental Prediction at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, said his agency's goal was to track solar storms from sun to mud, to predict where conditions followed a coronal mass ejection. For example, would be most intense in the ionosphere and on Earth in the form of underground electrical currents, and to calculate impacts on a variety of systems. One of the near-term challenges for policymakers will be to set benchmarks for assessing the vulnerability of various technology systems and establishing thresholds that would trigger protective or recovery responses, said William Murtagh, the Assistant Director for the Space Weather, Energy and Environment Division at the OSTP. There are currently working groups focused on these benchmarks amid efforts to reach out to other countries to establish international protocols for aviation conditions, mitigation strategies, and data sharing, among other areas. We do not fully understand these upper boundaries, but we need to. Once we understand how big these storms are, we can develop trigger points, he said, adding that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was interested in the 10,000-year storm. That's what they need to know. The technological and biological impacts of severe space weather events are now firmly in the federal government's sights, noted Andrew Jarrett, director of NGIT's Center for Solar Terrestrial Research. All things being equal, increased research funding from the represented federal agencies would further bolster the incorporation of space weather into our daily lives. Such development will enable the solar terrestrial community to, for the first time, see a solar storm, track its approach, and prepare accordingly. That's the Daily Mail, but we're going to go to another source. Okay, so this is from Science Mag Org News, right? And that other one was from Physics News. Yeah, so this is Science Mag News. Okay. By Julia Josh and July 14, 2016 at 2 p.m. Here's how the world could end and what we can do about it. She said that. In a dingy apartment building, insulated by layers of hanging rugs, the last family on Earth huddles around a fire, melting a pot of oxygen, ripped from the sun's warmth by a rogue dark star. The planet has been exiled to the cold outer reaches of the solar system. The lone clan of survivors might venture out into the endless night to harvest frozen atmospheric gases that have piled up like snow. As end of humanity scenarios go, that bleak vision from Fritz Leiber's 1951 short story, A Pail of Air, is a fairly remote possibility. Scholars who ponder such things think a self-induced catastrophe such as nuclear war or a bioengineered pandemic is most likely to do us in. However, a number of other extreme natural hazards, including threats from space and geological upheavals here on Earth, could still derail life as we know it, unraveling advanced civilization, wiping out billions of people, or potentially even exterminating our species. Nazan Martin Stojanevsky. Electrical surges due to a solar storm shocked telegraph operators in 1859. Today they could wreak havoc on power grids and electronics. Okay. Yet there's been surprisingly little research on the subject, says Anders Sandberg, a catastrophic researcher at the University of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute in the United Kingdom. Last he checked, there are more papers about dung beetle reproduction than human extinction, he says. We might have our priorities slightly wrong. Frequently, moderately severe disasters such as earthquakes attract far more funding than low-probability apocalyptic ones. Prejudice may also be at work. For instance, scientists who pioneered studies of asteroid and comet impacts complained about confronting a pervasive giggle factor. Consciously or unconsciously. Sandberg says many researchers consider catastrophic risks the province of fiction or fantasy, not serious science. A handful of researchers, however, persist in thinking the unthinkable. With enough knowledge and proper planning, they say, it's possible to prepare for, or in some cases prevent, rare but devastating natural disasters. Giggle all you want, but the survival of human civilization could be at stake. Threat 1. Solar storms. One threat to civilization could come not from too little sun, as in Lieber's story, but from too much. Bill Mertaig has seen how it might start. On the morning of 21st of July 2012, he sat before a colorful array of screens at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, watching twin clouds of energetic particles known as a coronal mass ejection (CME) erupt from the sun and barrel into space. A mere 19 hours later, the solar buckshot blazed past the spot where Earth had been just days before. If it had hit us, scientists say, we might still be reeling. Now, the assistant director of space weather at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in Washington, D.C., Mertaig, spends much of his time pondering solar eruptions. CMEs don't harm human beings directly, and their effects can be spectacular. By funneling charged particles into Earth's magnetic field, they can trigger geomagnetic storms that ignite dazzling auroral displays. But those storms can also use dangerous electrical currents in long-distance power lines. The currents last only a few minutes, but they can take out electrical grids by destroying high-voltage transformers, particularly at high latitudes, where Earth's magnetic field lines coverage as they arc toward the surface. Asteroid. Okay, and there's another one here. In 2012, satellites tracked this coronal mass ejection from the sun as it barely missed Earth. The worst CME event in recent history struck in 1989, frying a transformer in New Jersey and leaving 6 million people in Quebec province in Canada without power. The largest one on record, the Carrington event of 1859, named after the UK astronomer who witnessed the oncoming solar flare, was up to 10 times more intense. It sent searing currents racing through telegraph cables, sparking fires and shocking operators, while the northern lights danced as far south as Cuba. It was awesome, says Patricia Reif, a space physicist at Rice University in Houston, Texas. But if another storm that size structure, she says, there would be tremendous consequences. Some researchers fear that another Carrington-like event could destroy tens to hundreds of transformers, plunging vast portions of entire continents into the dark for weeks or months, perhaps even years, Mertaig says. That's because the custom-built house-sized replacement transformers can't be bought off the shelf. Transformer manufacturers maintain that such fears are overblown and that most equipment would survive. I remember a lot of people are building underground bunkers for a reason, so they can avoid whatever disasters to come. Because they know that it's not safe in these regular houses. It's not safe. But Thomas, over by and electrical engineer at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign says, "Nobody knows for sure. We don't have a lot of data associated with large storms because they are very rare," he says. "What's clear is that widespread blackouts could be catastrophic, especially in countries that depend on highly developed electrical grids. We've done a marvelous job creating a great vulnerability to this threat," Norteg says. "Information technologies, fuel pipelines, water pumps, ATMs, everything with a plug would be rendered useless. That's going to affect our ability to govern the country," Norteg says. ATMs shutting down. That sounds like we're heading that direction anyway. A major event could occur within our lifetimes. Research suggests that Carrington-like storms strike Earth once every few centuries. A recent study found a 12% chance that such a storm will occur in the next decade. But at least we will see it coming. Solar telescopes spot CMEs right when they form, and spacecraft stationed a million miles from Earth measure critical power meters as they pass by. Armed with information like the orientation of a CME's magnetic field, scientists can tell whether the particle cloud will flow around Earth like a rock in a river. Reeve says whether the field will connect with Earth to stir up a geomagnetic storm. Forecasters can then issue alerts 30 minutes to an hour before the CME hits. Such warnings are useful only if governments and grid operators are opposed to respond, and countries around the world have just started to take the threat seriously. Last year, the White House released a comprehensive national space weather strategy and an accompanying action plan laying out the need to reduce vulnerability and improve preparedness. A bipartisan bill to turn parts of the plan into reality will soon go before the Senate. One pillar of the plan is to fortify the electric grid. Spurred by regulatory authorities, operators have already begun taking stock of vulnerable components and critical assets. The next step will be to protect the grid by installing current-blocking devices such as series capacitors, already common in the western United States, because they aid long-distance power transmission, and by developing emergency procedures for manipulating power loads to limit transformer damage. Overby says the power industry's swift response has been encouraging. The full protection against a Carrington-like event might never be feasible. Overby says simply because of the cost. Instead, operators may react to an impending megastorm by preemptively shutting down large portions of the grid to save transformers, embracing short-term devastation to avert a long-term disaster. We've got threat to cosmic collisions. The Pan Stars Telescope on Maui in Hawaii is part of an astronomical network that scans the night sky for bodies that could someday collide with Earth, and that's by Stephen Alvarez, National Geographic Creative. For another menace from the sky, an impact by a large asteroid or comet, there is no way to limit the damage. The only way for humanity to protect itself, researchers say, is to prevent the collision altogether. That's something that we as a species can absolutely never ever let happen. Ed Liu says, that's the end of human beings. In 2002, Liu, a former astronaut, founded the B612 Foundation in Mill Valley, California, a private organization that works to protect the planet from near-Earth objects or NEOs. Everyone knows about the 10-kilometer-wide asteroid that helped destroy the dinosaurs, but even something a fraction of that size could devastate humanity, says Michael Rampino, an earth scientist at New York University in New York City. This impact site would be obliterated and massive earthquakes and tsunamis could radiate across the planet. Big flood. But the lingering effects would prove most devastating. Models suggest that depending on the speed and angle of approach, an object as small as 1 kilometer wide could throw up enough pulverized rock to block out the sun for months. Adding to the pall would be soot from wildfires ignited by debris falling back to Earth. All the stuff coming back into the atmosphere heats up, and it's like setting your oven on broil. Rapinoe explains. Together, the smoke and dust would cast the planet into a so-called impact winter, causing crop failures and mass starvation. Fortunately, asteroids of this size strike Earth only about once every few million years, and dino killers only once every 100 million years or so. Averaged annually, your chance of dying because of an impact is only slightly higher than that of perishing in a shark attack, says Mark Boslak, a physicist at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But like sharks, it only takes one to do the trick. You've got planets around the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and then you've got Earth, and you've got Mars and Jupiter up here. Astronomers have spotted almost 15,000 objects in Earth's neighborhood, including hundreds more than 1 kilometer across. NASA GPL Caltech, that's the image here they're talking about. That's why in 1998, NASA launched the SpaceGuard survey at the request of Congress. The goal was to enlist astronomers to identify 90% of the estimated 900 plus NEOs bigger than 1 kilometer, a goal the agency officially met in 2010. Ongoing efforts now aim to find any remaining giants and tag 90% of bodies larger than 140 meters by 2020, although NASA says it won't meet the deadline. Of the nearly 15,000 NEOs discovered so far, none are currently on a collision course with Earth. Eventually, however, an Earth-bound NEO of some size will confront humanity with a disaster movie scenario. And when that day comes, it's going to go from science fiction to science real pretty rapidly, Lou says. Science is already on the case. In defending planet Earth, near-Earth object surveys and hazard mitigation strategies, a 2010 report by the U.S. National Research Council, researchers highlighted several potential options for fending off an interloper, given a few decades of warning. We could whack it off course by ramming it with a spacecraft or two, slowly alter its orbit with the sustained gravitational pull of a spacecraft called a gravity tractor, or blast it with nuclear explosions. Right now, these planetary defense strategies exist mainly on paper, but some may see real-world tests in the next decade. NASA, the European Space Agency, and other partners are exploring a joint mission called AIDA, Asteroid Impact and Deflection Assessment, to test the impactor method on the asteroid Didymos when it passes near Earth in October 2020. NASA has also announced plans to use an enhanced gravity tractor in which the spaceship collects material from the asteroid to increase its mass on its asteroid redirect mission, which was set to launch in 2021, but now faces funding setbacks. In the event of an actual threat, many researchers favor a combination of these techniques, just to be safe. But for objects larger than 1 kilometer across, and for comets which could appear with little notice, some scientists think the nuclear option is the only option. The idea would be to jolt the body, not blow it up, which could do more harm than good. Although the 1967 United Nations Outer Space Treaty currently bars sending nuclear weapons into space, scientists already have a good understanding of the technology. The last year, NASA and the Department of Energy announced a joint effort to own its use against asteroids. Right, so we may need a nuclear weapon to save the planet, basically, if an asteroid tries to hit us. Okay. So although the 1967 United Nations Outer Space Treaty currently bars sending nuclear weapons into space, scientists already have a good understanding of the technology, and last year, NASA and the Department of Energy announced a joint effort to own its use against asteroids. Ultimately, NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, established earlier this year, will decide when and how the United States should respond to a potential threat or potential impact. Okay, we're going more in here. Threat tree, we've got supervolcanoes. Oh boy, exciting. The most inexorable threat to our modern civilization, however, is homegrown, and it strikes much more often than big cosmic impacts do. Right. Every 100,000 years or so, somewhere on Earth, a caldera up to 50 kilometers in diameter collapses and violently expels heaps of accumulated magma. The resulting supervolcano is both unstoppable and ferociously destructive. One such monster, the massive eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia 74,000 years ago, may have wiped out most humans on Earth, causing a genetic bottleneck still apparent in our DNA, although the idea is controversial. Ash blanket. Ash spreads across North America in computer-simulated eruption of the Yellowstone supervolcano by Larry Lawson. We've got weather patterns here. Different areas in America. I suppose that's where the ash came. So, don't know how to read these, unfortunately. By geological convention, a supervolcano is one that produces an explosive eruption of more than 450 cubic kilometers of magma, roughly 50 times more than the eruption of Indonesia's Mount Tambora in 1815, and 500 times more than the Philippines' Mount Pinatubo in 1991. Geologists read the histories of such blasts in deposits of erupted material called tuff, and the rock record shows that supervolcanoes tend to be repeat offenders. Locations that remain active today include Toba, the Yellowstone hotspot in northwestern United States, the Long Valley caldera in eastern California, the Tupa volcanic zone in New Zealand, and several spots in the Andes. Quick picture there again. Here. Okay. None of these danger zones now poses a threat, but in the event of another eruption, everything within 100 kilometers or so would be incinerated, and ash would blanket continents. Just a few millimeters of the stuff can kill crops. A meter more can make land unusable for decades, says Susanna Jenkins, a volcanologist at the University of Bristol, United Kingdom. Ash can also crush buildings, foul water supplies, clog electronics, ground airplanes, and irritate lungs. These regional impacts could ripple around the world in unexpected ways. Even the minor disruption in air traffic following the 2010 eruption of Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull, a far cry from a supervolcano, caused millions of dollars in losses for Kenyan farmers, whose perishable exports to Europe went to waste. The more interconnected our society becomes, the more vulnerable we are to something even quite small that happens over on the other side of the world, says Hazel Reimer, a volcanologist at the Open University in Milton Keynes, UK. We've got sizes of some famous eruptions which occurred. Right, so have Toba, we have Yellowstone Huckleberry Ridge, we have Yellowstone Lava Creek, Long Valley Caldera, we have Yellowstone Mesofault. Okay. Most far-reaching of all, however, would be the effects on global climate, which would resemble those of a large asteroid impact. Sulfate aerosols injected into the stratosphere by a super-eruption could drop temperatures over much of Earth by 5 Celsius to 10 Celsius for up to a decade, devastating global agriculture. Just how bad things would be is hard to say. Volcano science is based on experience, says Ben Kennedy, a volcanist at University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, and scientists have never witnessed a supervolcano. Knowledge of smaller eruptions can help, but it may be an unreliable guide. For instance, although super eruptions probably produce loads of sulfate aerosols, the aerosols may be larger and rain out faster than those from smaller eruptions, according to research by Claudia Timmerich, a climate modeler at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, Germany, and others. Timmerich's team has also found that for mid-latitudes, volcanoes like Yellowstone, the season in which the eruption occurs determines how widely its aerosols spread. The biggest uncertainties surround potential warning signs. Researchers think that widespread clues such as earthquakes, increased outgassing, and ground deformation due to rising magma would precede a major eruption. This unrest would begin months, if not many years, in advance, theoretically affording ample time to evacuate residents and set emergency response plans in motion. However, scientists would struggle to decide when to sound the alarm, says Jacob Lowenstern of the U.S. Geological Survey in Menlo Park, California, the scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory. It's going to be hard for scientists to convince themselves just because of our only partial understanding of the complexity of the processes that are taking place, he says. Then there are the political challenges of responding to the threat. The 1985 eruption of Nevado del Ruiz in Colombia killed 23,000 people, in part because the government ignored scientists' forecasts. False alarms can cause trouble too. In the 1980s, geological unrest caused officials to warn that California's Long Valley caldera could erupt. It didn't, but local real estate values tanked and the economy suffered. So it's like it's a gamble. The challenge for scientists is to tell which indicators portend a catastrophic eruption instead of a small one, or none at all. We're terribly good at recognizing precursors after the event, Reimer says. For now, researchers say their best bet is to continue studying the plumbing that feeds volcanoes and to squeeze as much information as possible from smaller future eruptions before the next supervolcano lets loose. Then we have another thread. And this thread is, let's see. In the end, no amount of research can do much to prevent or mitigate supervolcanoes or other freak events such as nearby supernova explosions and cosmic blasts of gamma rays. Our only hope of surviving them is a fallback plan. And the bottom line in that plan is food. At least 2 scientists have already sketched out a blueprint. In their 2015 book, Feeding Everyone No Matter What, David Denkenberger and Joshua Peirce propose several ways to feed billions of people without the help of the sun. Denkenberger, an architectural engineer at Tennessee State University in Nashville, started moonlighting as a catastrophic researcher a few years ago, after reading that fungi may have thrived after previous mass extinctions. Fungi, right? If humans ever face a similar threat, he thought, why don't we just eat the mushrooms and not go extinct? Indeed, people could grow mushrooms on leaf litter and on the trunks of trees killed by the disaster. Denkenberger says, even better would be raising methane-digesting bacteria on diets of natural gas, or converting this cellulose in plant biomass to sugar, a process already used to make biofuel. Denkenberger and Peirce, an engineering professor at Michigan Technological University and Houghton, calculate that retrofitting existing industrial plants, survivors of a catastrophe, could produce enough of such alternative foods to feed the world's population several times over. Of course, a few other ingredients would have to survive as well. Infrastructure, international cooperation, and the rule of law. Whether human society endures or snaps is the unknown on which everything else could hinge, says Seth, Executive Director of the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute in New York City, a non-profit think tank whose researchers include Denkenberger. How would we fare? I think the only reasonable answer one can give to the question at this time is that we have absolutely no idea, Baum says. To him, social resilience after a catastrophe is just another question for scientists to address, instead of leaving it to dystopian writers and doomsday preppers. Not that he is anything against survivalists, as much as they might seem silly on television. I'm actually a little happier knowing that there are people out there doing that stuff, Baum says. He quickly adds, hopefully it'll never come down to just that. And there's a guy who says, be responsible and prepare, even if it's a small chance it's going to happen. See, find him here. I see. See. Warning. Advice. He says to stack up on food. Hold on a sec. Where is he now? As he's got some great advice. I can find him now. You have John Little. As well. Might be too long though. Here we go. Nick Hodgson, that's his name. To the end of it. It's kind of long. Sorry, you can't hear.
Destroy all electronics and electric grids that are protected 98% of our world. And we can sit there and blame the government. Well, we are a dynamic group of individuals that govern our own lives, and we should take personal responsibility. So, what does that mean? First of all, recognize that it's not if it will happen, it's when it will happen.
It's not if it will happen, it's when it will happen.
Focus on what NASA has scientifically verified is the probability of when it's going to occur, which is 12% every 10 years. If it does happen, be in a position of strength, be fully prepared to have a food supply for at least 2 or 3 years for yourself.
Start getting food and have it for 3 years. How many people are going to do that?
And do not ignore the likelihood that this will happen in your life. The fact that it hasn't happened is serendipitously remarkable and unusual. We are already beyond the range of statistical averages in the last 175 years that a character event hasn't occurred again. Remember also that though the Carrington event of 1859, and look it up on Wikipedia, was a relatively significant atmospheric event, it was by no means a spectacularly large coronal mass ejection. They can be 10 times bigger and can give the Earth as little as from 3 to 18 hours warning, depending on their speed of travel. There are ways of being informed by cell phone that it's coming. NASA has set up a system like that. I also have that information on my Facebook site called Solar Storm Awareness. But
Solar Storm Awareness.
Ground yourself in an understanding of the probability of its occurrence. Anticipate a much greater coronal mass ejection than mass ejections, solar flares, heavily protonized solar wind, generally always misses us. But NASA has said that there's so many large coronal mass ejections coming off the sun that we have a 12% chance of being hit by one every 10 years.
Every 10 years we've 12%
That's really, really dramatic.
of a chance of being hit
It
by an
wouldn't
asteroid.
matter if the date was 1641 or 1810, because we didn't have an electric grid, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cell phone towers. All we would notice is a fabulous display of the northern lights, aurora borealis, down in the south. And we would go about our days, and then the weather patterns might be a bit strange for a few years. Back then it wouldn't have mattered. We hadn't cut down 2 trillion trees. The atmosphere, the climate of the world wasn't so unstable because of the overpopulation of the planet. So historically, we don't have a reference point of the impact of a coronal mass ejection hitting the Earth. Now we are incredibly vulnerable. Why are we vulnerable? Because we depend on the electric grid. Because we depend on the internet. Because we depend on vehicles that are controlled by electronic sensors and computers. Because all the trucks out there that deliver our food depend on electronic systems in their engine infrastructure. And all of those systems can be short-circuited by a massive dose of electron protons radiating into our atmosphere from a solar flare. The Earth is protected by a magnetosphere, and to a degree by the stratosphere, which dilutes and filters and protects us from moderate solar flares. But if one is powerful enough, like the one in 1859, which is called the Carrington effect, which was also seen by a fellow called Richard Hodgson as well as Richard Carrington, but he called it the Carrington effect, we would be sent back to the Stone Age or at least the Middle Ages. We would not have electricity, we would not have an electron. Most forms of transport that were made post 1975. The electric grid is down. But the infrastructure in America at this time will not be able to replace the transformers in the electric grid. So there won't be electricity possibly for years. That are pretty much, well, they're ignored by the general public. A coronal mass ejection by 2 days, because the Earth's orbit was just 2 days ahead of the curve, but hundreds of millions of people around the world will die of starvation. Magnetosphere, stratosphere, it can broil electronics and electric grids that aren't protected. 98% of them are not. And we can sit there and blame the government. Well, we are a dynamic group of individuals that govern our own lives, and we should take personal responsibility. So, what does that mean? First of all, recognize that it's not if it happens, when.
Okay, be responsible. Going to go to this one here. Be a little bit.
Welcome to A Minute to Midnight. This is Tony, and we have a guest on our show today, John Little. John has 2 websites, omegashop.com and ezekielspire.com. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate you. Great to be able to talk to someone on our side of the Pacific for once in a while. while.
Yes, but you've still got that American accent, which I don't have.
Right, exactly. Of course, there aren't too many of us Americans here living in Taipei, but there's a few of us running around, and I must tell you that I really love Taipei and Taiwan.
Uh-huh.
Being married to the most beautiful woman in this, my favorite Bible reading, it uses kind of like, pass it off like, okay, fine, and I just move on.
Yeah.
So many times that we do when we're not really sure what all this is, and so I just, okay, fine, and then I hit Isaiah 30, and I go, whoa, wait a second, whoa, because Isaiah 30 talks about the sun becoming as bright as 7 days and the moon as bright as the sun. And I thought, well, wait a second. This is because the events of that both Isaiah 30 and Ezekiel 38 and 39, they're both talking about the same moment in time. And all the things that happen, the earthquakes and all of that. And then wait a second, there's also Zechariah. And Zechariah talks about horses that are driven blind and madness that happens. And I thought, wait a second, okay, so unless everybody is going to go back to riding horses, and if that happens, by the way, just look around you. Can you imagine a situation where we would all be forced to going back to riding horses? I don't know about you, but that's really serious.
I think if it was at that point, there'd be an awful lot of dead people first.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, no, really. I mean, it would be an incredible catastrophe one way or the other. So, as I'm sitting here looking at this, I thought, wait a second. What if horses are a euphemism for transport? Yeah. Cars, trains, automobiles, things like that. I mean, here, Zechariah is speaking in terms that people could understand at that time. And so as you weave both events, Zechariah 12 and 13, Isaiah 30, and then Ezekiel 38 and 39, you start to get the understanding, wait a second, those are all connected together. Now, those of us that have been paying attention to things, and this is what I do with omegashock.com, I got all upset. In fact, I remember the day that I got all upset. And there's a reason why I'm kind of pulling us back, because it was April 5th, 2011, in which I woke up to an enormous threat that we are all facing in one way or another. Less of us over here on our side of the Pacific, but on the other side, they are much more in danger of an electromagnetic pulse attack, where a nuclear weapon has exploded over about maybe, say, 300 miles above the United States, and out there goes American civilization.
Yeah, well, I mean, like North Korea has practiced, and Iran, I think, detonating something at that sort of height, 180 miles or whatever, up in the air. So why are they doing that? It certainly doesn't seem like a failed nuclear weapon. It seems like a deliberate test.
It sounds like that to me, and there are now 2 North Korean satellites that are orbiting the Earth, and there may be nuclear weapons in those satellites. So anyways, so that's what got omegashock.com started. And so here I was, up until 2014, reading through my Bible, and when Zechariah 12, I think it's Zechariah 12, when it talks about the horses becoming blind. What happens to a horse when it is blind? It does not move. It doesn't work. It goes nowhere. And so what I realize is that I'm looking at what appears to be an EMP attack. But when you put in Isaiah chapter 30, where the sun becomes as bright as 7 days and the moon as bright as the sun, that's when we start to realize, wait a second, this isn't an EMP attack from man. This is an EMP attack from God using the sun. And how would it look like this solar flare? Well, what is a flare? A flare is essentially fire. So it would be the fire that rains down on Gog and Magog. And then as those three verses kind of hit me all at once, and I started to see the implications of all of this, I realized that 1 billion people could die.
Yeah.
Think of all the things that will stop working. The power plants that will no longer provide electricity. And of course, what are the pumps that keep our water flowing? What do they use? They use electricity. There are very few places in the world where the water that comes out of our faucets is powered by gravity. There are gravity-fed places. I mean, I think I've been told that there are maybe 2%, maybe 3% of all the fresh drinkable water is gravity-powered. Everything else requires an electric pump to keep the pressure going so that you can have water to drink. So when that shuts off, when this solar flare hits, that is going to, I honestly believe it's going to be 1 billion people that are going to die.
Yeah. See, well, in 1859, there was that geomagnetic solar storm, which was known as the Carrington event, a kind of a white light flare recorded by a couple of English astronomers, Carrington and Hodgson, I think their names were, and an event at that time, of course, there wasn't much electricity. It was very, very new in 1859, and so it wouldn't have created a huge lot of problem back then because they weren't reliant on electricity. But if the same thing happened today, even on that scale, it would cause widespread destruction and problems and chaos. But you're sort of suggesting something much bigger than just a solar event of that size, aren't you?
Right. No, actually, the Carrington event itself. I mean, they were talking about the telegraph lines burning. I mean, this was a huge, huge deal. Yeah, there is something bigger than that's coming, and up until, in fact, when I wrote the book, I mean, the book Ezekiel's Fire is available in PDF. You can download it if you go to the website ezekielsfire.com. First of all, the book is all there. You can download the PDF. It's all free. But when I was writing this thing, and I'm continually updating it, so I'm going to be adding this new bit of information in, I had not run across the term super flare.
Yeah.
And see, we are normally used to M-class flares and X-class flares. Those terms are recognizable to us. But we've never talked about a super flare. And now the question is this: is a super flare possible? Well, the only reason why we have this term super flare is because astronomers have observed this happening in stars that are like our own.
Right.
Our sun is considered a G-class star. And G-class stars are remarkably stable stars. They don't fluctuate very much. Our sun has fluctuated between 0.1 and 0.2% on a year-to-year basis. We go through even solar maximums and solar minimums. There isn't very much in the way of variation. But when it comes to a super flare, and yes, our sun could give us a super flare, it will destroy a large part of technical civilization. And the interesting question is, what part of the Earth will be the most affected? And I'm hoping that you and I are in a very good place, that we don't have to worry so much about it, but I'm not completely certain.
Why would you think we would be?
Well, the interesting thing is this. First of all, and this is where we bring in, maybe I should bring in, what is the timing? When does this super flare happen? That super flare happens at the time of the coming of Gog and Magog.
Yeah.
Now, those of us that have spent time in the Middle East, myself included, we know that combat fighting doesn't happen in the wintertime. It only happens in the summertime because, frankly, a lot of the Middle East is impassable during the wintertime because a lot of rain happens and the area becomes muddy and impassable.
Right.
So Gog and Magog is going to come when the fields are dry, the roads are dry, everything is going to be fine for fighting. So Gog and Magog is going to happen at the time in the summertime. Well, and the summertime is when the northern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun as opposed to the southern hemisphere. So it's going to be the summertime. So you, as far as I'm concerned, are going to be far safer from a solar flare such as this. For myself, I'm a little bit on the northern hemisphere. I'm here in Taiwan.
Yeah.
The thing is this, hopefully, the biggest effect is going to be towards Europe, because it says that when fire comes down in Gog and Magog, it hits the land of Magog and in the isles where they dwell carelessly. Now, I'm on an island. Taiwan is an island. We do dwell kind of carelessly. I don't know. We're not terribly worried about attack, power that they project into the world. For America to not attempt to stop Gog and Magog coming down and invading the Middle East, for America not to do that, that tells me that either America's power has been destroyed, or America itself has been destroyed. Now, my preference is that America's power has been destroyed, but it exists as a country, and lots and lots of people have not died, and everything's fine.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, with the way that America has been acting in terms of their foreign policy, the things that they've been doing, just provoking Russia in the way that they have, something tells me that America's power has been neutralized so effectively. Well, I'm thinking that already an EMP attack has happened on America. I mean, why? Speaking of something, I was so upset when America staged that coup in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, if I was Putin and I saw these threats to Russia's existence, where the neocons are attempting to destroy Russia,
Yeah.
The first thing I'd want to do is start a plan where I would use an EMP weapon to neutralize America. I mean, that's what I would do as someone who wants to protect his own country. So there's something that tells me, in terms of just the way the world is moving, something has destroyed America. Now, that's just a theory on my part. There's nothing, I can't point to anything biblical in terms of that. But I can't, so I don't know what exactly happens to America, but there's one thing that I am completely certain of. And that's this solar flare that I would call a super flare. And those of us that are listening to this, just do a search for the word super flare. And you'll get a lot there. Just we're seeing towns where the water is so terrible, where trucks are moving food back and forth and we have just-in-time delivery. This coming of Gog and Magog, and by the way, let me lay out something carefully for people. There are two comings of Gog and Magog.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. And I know a lot of people are a little confused by this,
yeah.
But if you read the areas where they talk about the coming of Gog and Magog, you will notice that they are two separate events. There's the Gog and Magog that is after the millennium in the book of Revelation. That is at the end of the world, before God, redoes the universe and there's a new heaven and a new earth. Okay? That's that Gog and Magog. This Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39. That Gog and Magog is not just before the end of the universe.
Yeah.
It is not just before the end of the world. It is before the tribulation.
Yeah.
This is a completely separate event. And so please don't get, and I know it's interesting, when you go over, when you read the Bible, you see a strange word like Magog. I mean, no, and you're like, well, wait a second, that's such a bizarre word. It must be connected to that same word in the book of Revelation. we are looking for these events coming together, and I believe, and this is the other part of all this, how quickly this is coming.
Yeah.
I believe that Gog and Magog could be coming within 2 years.
Yeah.
So, and as I'm looking at this carefully, now it could be longer, it could be even shorter. I doubt that it will be next year, but it will. But there's a very high chance that it could be in 2018.
Right.
And then after 2018, I mean, the chance of Gog and Magog coming escalates further and further. And the reason why I say that is that, remember, most of those of us that are listening to our conversation here, we know that we live in the last days.
Yeah.
This is something that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. And he spoke of it as a span of time that is a generation long. And when Jesus gave the list of events that were going to happen within this generation, the span of a generation, one of those events was the capture of Jerusalem by the non-Gentiles. Now, he used that term very carefully to emphasize that it's not Gentile-controlled anymore, Jerusalem.
Right.
And I can tell you, having been a resident of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem area for 15 years, the old city of Jerusalem is under complete and utter control. So from that moment in time, it's like a clock started ticking.
Yeah.
And it's a generation clock, and we are very close to the end of that generation clock.
So did it start in 1948 or 1967?
The risk of diverting our attention to the Middle East because it's such a fast rushing down into it. If it is, if it's Turkey, then that will bring us Gog and Magog. Well, then along comes this horrendous super flare that will, well, I suspect it'll at least knock civilization back. It'll take some time to recover.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, many, many, many people will die.
Yeah.
So
I kind of, there's a couple of things, I've sort of often thought that the Gog-Magog war could be the thing that kicks off at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. I sort of hold the opinion that, to me, the most likely candidate for Mystery Babylon actually appears to be America. Now, whether the Book of Revelation is chronological order, that's something I'm not too sure on. And so it's like fitting the whole picture together, but it's also, the Book of Revelation doesn't really tell us how long the Book of Revelation is. All we know is once the Antichrist comes to power, he has 3.5 years, but we don't really, to me, I can't think we can say, right, the Book of Revelation is a 7-year book or whatever it's like. It could be stretched out longer than that. So that's my thoughts on it anyway.
No, I believe me, I have, I've had a lot of discussions over this with a lot of different people, and there's just an enormous, it's a very confusing book, because I think part of the problem is the events that will happen between now and then are going to be so confusing and difficult that it's hard for us to see. We have to get through the next few years for us to really see the events of Revelation more clearly.
Yeah.
Now, there is one thing that I would like to add in all of this in terms of the book of Revelation. Because remember in, I think it's Revelation chapter 12, when it talks about the woman with the crown of 12 stars. For that, I interpret that woman to be physical Israel. Remember, she's the woman that gave birth to the Messiah, to the baby that was caught up into heaven. So this physical Israel, as I interpret things, that physical Israel that goes into the desert and is protected for a time, times, and a half a time, there at least must be a certain amount of time for that physical Israel to gain a certain amount of spiritual maturity, because right now, Israel is not saved. They have not accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
And even those who wanted to claim that Judaism is accepted by God, which I disagree, 75% of Israel is atheist.
Yeah.
There is, and of the rest, really a very tiny percentage of Israelis really even believes in Judaism as it is described in the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Tanakh. So the point is this: there must be a revolutionary change to Israel before the tribulation can happen, so that she can be that woman that goes into the desert. And I believe that as you look at Isaiah 30 and Zechariah 12 and 13 and Ezekiel 38 and 39 and the other prophets, we're talking about that revolutionary change right now. So yes, I do believe that Gog and Magog happens before the tribulation, but it is at least a few years. How many years, of course, is up to debate. But it has to be enough years so that the world recovers.
Right.
And here's this other thought, and this is an interesting thing, as I've sort of thought about the coming of the Antichrist.
Yeah.
What would it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's on everybody's mind.
Yeah.
What would give the Antichrist the opportunity to gather power? But when you have a crisis like this, and he rises up, and he's the person that helps organize things together, and he kind of brings society back together, and he helps bring people back. But as he goes through the process of bringing society and civilization back, he exerts his own control and says, you cannot be a part of our civilization. You cannot be rescued unless you take the mark of the beast, unless you have his image or be a part of his system. And yeah, I hear these stories of underground depots and underground. Yeah, I don't know what to make of all this. I mean, I try to take a very cynical view of events because I know there's a lot of static in the signal that we're getting about what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of confusing stuff. Some of it's deliberate disinformation too.
I agree. Just a lot of things are happening. So I'm like, well, I don't know for sure. I do know the Bible is true. And there's this thing, and this is where, when people talk about America being Mystery Babylon, and this is where I get, because there's two theories about Mystery Babylon, and I sometimes will bounce back and forth, but there is this that talks about the beast with one of the heads with the deadly wound.
Yeah.
And is it an EMP attack that the beast recovers from? Is it this massive super flare that we're talking about? Is that the deadly wound that this beast recovers from?
I have a theory that, I'm actually kind of an idea that whatever it is, the solar flare or the Planet X event or whatever it is that knocks out things, and that people maybe say are without electricity and that for a period of time, and I don't know exactly how long that is, and so your televisions and computers and all that don't work, and then one day, bam, it's back. And at that point, that you have the New World Order and the Antichrist assuming power, and really taking the system from there on.
Yeah, in fact, that's kind of how I see things.
Good.
Now again, I'm just one guy, speaking from Taipei, and who knows what the truth is.
German secret societies ran into a group of Nordic-looking beings that phones. According to Sean Martin at the Express, he reports that a huge solar storm is heading towards Earth, which can leave us without mobile phones, satellite television, and even electricity. According to the report here, in modern-day Britain could go into meltdown after scientists forecast the solar storm to hit between now and Friday, which could wreak havoc on technology. They say solar storms affect Earth's technology as radiation is thrown at the planet from the sun, and while humans are protected from the radiation by the atmosphere, they say the rays can heat the outer atmosphere, causing it to expand, which can affect satellites in orbit. That could also lead to lack of GPS navigation, mobile phone signals, as well as satellite TV. They write higher currents in the magnetosphere, the Earth's magnetic field, could lead to a surge of electricity in power lines, which could blow out electrical transformers, power stations, leading to a temporary loss of electricity. They say in a specific region. They also write that this usually occurs in areas where of high altitude. So
it's causing the sudden solar activity. After all, the sun has been relatively quiet for some time. Do the sudden changes on the surface of our sun pose any threat or impending danger to our planet? Let's listen to Dr. Keiko, an American theoretical physicist, futurist, and popularizer of science, who is the science professor at the City College of New York, as he attempts to alert the public to the dangers of a major solar eruption and how it could potentially affect life on Earth. If you listen very carefully, you will notice that Dr. Keiko is providing an in-depth analysis of the dangers that await us due to the strange behavior of the sun, which he states is acting rather peculiar.
What is new with Professor Kaku these days?
Well, this past weekend, something happened which really disturbed me, and that is the sun is having this temper tantrum, and it's getting worse and worse.
Oh.
We had 5 solar flares that were up last week, 2 just in the past weekend. NASA satellites were just overwhelmed by the size of the flare that came out of the sun. Two flares came out of the sun on Friday and Saturday, and we're headed towards the 11-year sunspot cycle maximum now. And the fear is that one of these solar flares could hit the Earth, in which case all hell could break loose. And
It's just a matter of time, isn't it?
it's a matter of time. We've had a big one about 150 years ago in 1859. We had a huge solar flare that hit the Earth. Back then, we only had telegraph wires, but even they were shorted out. And you could read the newspaper in Cuba at night by the light of the northern lights, the aurora borealis, as far south as Cuba. And from that, we physicists can recalculate how big that solar flare of 1859 must have been. If we were hit with another one like that, it would fry our satellites. Communications would go down instantly. Power plants would be shorted out. And in a worst case, remember, this is a worst case scenario now.
That's right.
We physicists believe that it could be 20 times worse than Hurricane Katrina.
Oh, my God.
So imagine 20 Hurricane Katrinas ravaging the Earth simultaneously. And you can begin to estimate the kind of damage you can get if there's a direct hit from one of these solar flares. And, we're headed toward the maximum. More and more flares are going off the sun. We had another big one last month, by the way. So far, we've dodged the bullet. So far, we've been able to miss the solar flares. But these solar flares are like bullets. Sunspots are like rifles. Think of rifles shooting bullets into outer space and missing the Earth, because, of course, outer space is quite big. But one of these days, one of these solar flares is going to hit the Earth, like what happened in 1859, and then all hell could break loose.
Yeah, if it's the right size and it hits us on a direct angle, or if we are in trouble, and we haven't insulated the grid, everything could go down. I'll tell you what concerns me too, Mitch Hughes.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if the power goes out? What about all our nuke plants, and we won't have the ability to, they will melt down, won't they?
Yeah, take a look at what happened in Japan. The the backup power generators were in the basement. You can't think of anything worse, any worse place to put a generator than in the basement of a building. It was flooded almost immediately by the tsunami. And so the reactor almost instantly was dead in the water. They had no power. And because they had no power, there was no safety systems. And then we had 3 simultaneous core meltdowns in Fukushima. But the uranium actually liquefied. We've never seen a totally liquefied core before. First time in history. But the Fukushima reactor actually melted totally. And so we could have lots of these around the country if there's a power blackout because of a solar flare. Simultaneously, we lose pump activity, we lose backup power, we lose the ability to control the control rod. It would be a nightmare.
And how long?
Well, it only takes a few hours for a core meltdown to get off the ground. And by the way, at Fukushima, you may ask yourself a simple question. If the core melted completely, then how come we didn't have a China syndrome? How come there wasn't an explosion that blew the roof off like Chernobyl? And the reason is that in Fukushima, one of the workers disobeyed orders. He was under a direct order not to flush the core with seawater, because that would destroy the core. The utility thought they could revive the reactor still. They had illusions about that. But he disobeyed orders. He made the only correct decision during the first few days. He flooded the reactor with seawater, and he stopped the devastation of northern Japan. He's a national hero. And he disobeyed orders.
He may have saved many, many lives.
Oh, definitely. And we could have something similar if we lose power in the United States or, around the planet Earth. If there's a gigantic solar storm, if there's a hurricane from hell and from outer space. Now, we physicists went to Congress last year, and we asked Congress for a few $100 million, that's some change, to reinforce our power plants, to build a backup grid, to make our satellites so that we can shut them down in case of a major flare, or maybe even have safety systems on the next generation of satellites. And we got nothing. Congress just laughed at us. But, we're the physicists of this country. We're the American Physical Society. We're the organization of physicists in this country. And we said, Congress, these are rare events, maybe once in 100 years, once in a 200-year event, but it's inevitable. It's inevitable that one of these bullets is going to hit the Earth like what happened 150 years ago. And when that happens, it's going to be worse than Katrina.
It's an insurance policy. Why would they not jump all over this?
Well, they said things like, times are hard and, the probability of an event is low. But, power blackouts have happened because of sunspot activity. In Quebec, Canada, for example, and in South Africa, certain cities were hit with solar flares, but they were not a direct hit. They were like a grazing blow to the Earth. And we've had power blackouts. Now, here's the problem. We're very young in the space age. We've only had experiences with the sunspot cycles for only a few cycles because, Sputnik only went up in 1957. We haven't had experience, but these solar flares have been going on for billions of years. But we never had electricity for billions of years. We've only had electricity for 100 years. And so we have no experience with one of these things. And so it's just like hurricanes. People think that, hurricanes are bad, but they're very rare. So why bother to prepare for them? Then one day it hits you, and then you lose $50 billion like in Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah, I think it's foolish that they're not doing this with you. They should have jumped all over your proposals, and that it should have been implemented right now. We should be building infrastructure right now, insulating the grid, protecting our power plants. It's going to bite us one. I can feel it.
That's right. And, you can imagine the chaos. If all of a sudden we have power blackouts simultaneously across the country, no rescue crews are going to come in from neighboring cities because they too will be knocked out. So you're not going to see ambulances and fire trucks from neighboring cities to take care of us in case of a power blackout. And then food is going to rot in refrigerators, as what happened with Hurricane Sandy. It only takes a few days for food to rot. And new food is not going to come in from the outside because there is no outside. And so food riots are going to start in a few days because people realize that there's no food to eat because all the food is rotten because there's no electricity. And so you can imagine the kind of chaos we're going to have. Now, here in the Northeast, we had Hurricane Sandy, but, we got relief from the outside. The rest of the country was not paralyzed. The airports were up and running in a few days, and so shipments of food, trucks can come in. But can you imagine what happens if there's no outside? That if they, too, are hit simultaneously with one of these will hit the peak of this solar cycle. And so the temper tantrums that we had last week will be multiplied in the coming weeks. And there'll be more and more newspaper reports, especially from NASA, monitoring the sun, because we never used to do this before, by the way. We never used to monitor these things. Now we monitor them, because now we begin to realize, oh my God, this could really be a big one.
Now it's scarce. I wonder what the Mayans really knew with you when they talk about the Mayan calendar end date. I wonder if it was truly going to be some kind of solar event.
Well, I don't know. All I know is that the laws of physics tell us that it happens every 11 years. The reason for that, by the way, is that the North Pole and the South Pole of the sun flip every 11 years. Because the sun spins, it sort of like winds up its magnetic field lines, like winding the windings of a clock. If you wind the windings of a clock too much, it springs open, pops out at you, right? That's what happens every 11 years. When the sun spins, it winds up its magnetic field lines, like winding up the windings of a clock. And after 11 years, it can't take it anymore and goes boing, 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 boing,
Up it goes.
and goes north-south flip. And so we have a pole shift for the sun every 11 years. And this has been going on, of course, for billions of years. But we didn't have a space program back then. We didn't have power grids back then to worry about.
The consideration of a super solar disruption creating havoc on our planet is a very real probability. As described by Dr. Keiko, it happened to our planet in the past and is likely to happen once again. The Carrington event of 1859 was one of the largest geomagnetic storms to ever hit the Earth, and its impact was tremendous, knocking out telegraph communications across Europe and North America. In addition, auroras were observed as far south as the Caribbean and at latitudes very close to the equator. Here is a short video clip on what took place in 1859.
Okay.
In 1755, man began to record the storm activity on the Sun. Solar cycle 10 lasted for 11.3 years, from December 1855 until March 1867. During this cycle, the solar storm of 1859, also known as the Carrington superstorm, was the most powerful sunstorm ever recorded. From the 28th of August, 1859, until the 2nd of September, numerous sunspots and solar flares were observed on the surface of the Sun. Just before noon on the 1st of September, the British astronomer Richard Carrington witnessed the largest solar flare ever recorded. The solar flare ejected a plasma cloud that traveled from the surface of the Sun for just over 18 hours before finally reaching the Earth. As the dawn broke on the 1st of September 1859, the skies all over planet Earth erupted in red, green, and purple lights so brilliant the newspapers could be read as if it were daylight. Stunning northern lights pulsated at the tropical latitudes over Cuba, the Bahamas, and Jamaica. Telegraph systems worldwide went haywire. Spark discharges shocked telegraph operators and set the telegraph paper on fire. Even when the telegraph operators disconnected the batteries powering the lines, electric currents in the wires still allowed messages to be transmitted. A sunstorm of this sort today could cause billions of dollars of damage to the Earth's satellites and terrestrial power grids, and disrupt radio and cell phone communications. In the 160-year recorded history of geomagnetic storms, the Carrington event is the biggest.
As this video implies, there is no doubt that our Sun is a powerful force that can inflict great turmoil on our planet. But what if the dangers that our star can inflict are in some way influenced by an unknown force? One unfamiliar to the modern-day astronomers and scientists, but a force which the world has not prepared for. In essence, the effects of a celestial body, estimated to be 4 to 8 times the size of our Earth, entering our solar system. 2015, the topic of Planet X created an off-the-chart internet frenzy, in large part because many people were convinced that this rogue planet would cause enormous amounts of space debris from the asteroid belt.
A bit tired now. This is Physics News 2016-04. No. Oh, sorry. It's from Tracy Regan, 6th of April, 2016. Now, the inspector of a geomagnetic solar storm with the ferocity to disrupt communications satellites, knock out GPS systems, shut down air travel, and quench lights, computers, and telephones in millions of homes for days, months, or even years, has yet to grip the public as a panic-inducing possibility. But it is a scenario that space scientists, global insurance corporations, and government agencies from the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, to NASA, to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, take seriously, calling it a low probability but high impact event that merits a substantial push on several fronts: research, forecasting, and mitigation strategy. Space weather experts gather at a recent conference in Washington, D.C. that drew space weather specialists from academia, the federal government, the military, and private industry. Louise Lanzarote, distinguished research professor at NJIT's Center for Solar Terrestrial Research, summed up the implications of a massive, well-timed solar storm for today's technology-based, hyper-connected global society. Since the development of the electrical telegraph in the 1840s, space weather processes have affected the design, implementation, and operation of many engineered systems. At first on Earth and now in space, noted Lanzarote, a panelist at the conference. As the complexity of such systems increases, as new technologies are invented and deployed, and as humans have ventured beyond Earth's surface, both human-built systems and humans themselves become more susceptible to the effects of Earth's space environment. In addition to disrupting communications and energy grids, what is broadly known as space weather, powerful bursts of electromagnetic radiation, energetic charged particles, and magnetized plasma, has the potential to corrode water and sewer pipelines, to erase historical data stored in computer memory, to undermine military and security operations, and to harm astronauts traveling in space. The symposium, Space Weather Science and Applications, Research for Today, Training for Tomorrow, sponsored by the University Space Research Association, USRA, and the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, focused on the growing urgency for both basic scientific research and the development of practical applications in the field. Once systems start to fail, the outages could cascade in ways we can't even conceive, said Daniel Baker, director of the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics at the University of Colorado Boulder, and also a panelist who recommends increasing support for the development of engineering systems and devices capable of protecting Earth's infrastructure. $1 trillion recovery. In a 2013 report, Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, put the population at risk of a massive storm at between 20 to 40 million, with durations up to 1 to 2 years, depending largely on the availability of spare replacement transformers. The cost of such recovery would range between $600 billion and $2.6 trillion. The symposium followed on the heels of a conference late last year, Space Weather, Understanding Potential Impacts and Building Resilience, convened in Washington, D.C., under the auspices of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, and also attended by scientists and engineers from academia and industry, as well as satellites. We need data to support particular military operations, Stoffler said, adding that the Air Force relies on GPS for missions such as piloting remote aircraft in Afghanistan from the US. If we can predict space weather, we can have other operations in place or delay. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has recently added space weather to its daily operations briefings. We know there is a gap in our ability to assess vulnerability and consequences, said Jack Anderson, a senior analyst at DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate, adding that while there is currently no scale for predicting the magnitude of a storm, as exists for hurricanes, for example, we need to develop that at FEMA. William LaPenta, director of the National Centers for Environmental Prediction at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, said his agency's goal was to track solar storms from sun to mud, to predict where conditions followed a coronal mass ejection, for example, would be most intense in the ionosphere and on Earth in the form of underground electrical currents, and to calculate impacts on a variety of systems. One of the near-term challenges for policymakers will be to set benchmarks for assessing the vulnerability of various technology systems and establishing thresholds that would trigger protective or recovery responses, said William Murtagh, the Assistant Director for the Space Weather, Energy and Environment Division at the OSTP. There are currently working groups focused on these benchmarks, amid efforts to reach out to other countries to establish international protocols for aviation conditions, mitigation strategies, and data sharing, among other areas. We do not fully understand these upper boundaries, but we need to. Once we understand how big these storms are, we can develop trigger points, he said, adding that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was interested in the 10,000-year storm. That's what they need to know. The technological and biological impacts of severe space weather events are now firmly in the federal government's sights, noted Andrew Jarrett, director of NGIT's Center for Solar Terrestrial Research. All things being equal, increased research funding from the represented federal agencies would further bolster the incorporation of space weather policymakers and elected officials. At that time, the OSTP laid out a multi-part action plan to address, as Lanzarote put it, civil societal issues related to all aspects of space weather. In an OPD piece that followed, Lanzarote, who was also panelist at that conference, called the federal plan impressive for its analysis and coverage of the measurements, data, and models that will be required to ensure security under space weather events of all types, from huge geomagnetic storm produced telluric currents initiated by coronal mass ejections to solar radio produced outages of GPS receivers to radiation effects by magnetosphere, solar, and galactic radiation to satellite drag effects from Earth's atmosphere and ionosphere. These areas are the focus of NGIT's Center for Solar Terrestrial Research, which has a variety of instruments in space and on the ground for observing and recording space weather, including the world's largest solar optical telescope at Big Bear Solar Observatory, a solar radio telescope array in Owens Valley, instruments across Antarctica and abroad, spacecraft in the Van Allen radiation belts. At the recent symposium, Tamara Dickinson, the Principal Assistant Director for Environment and Energy at the OSTP, described recent minor storms that had caused disruption, a blackout in Sweden during which NASA also detected anomalies in deep space missions, and several years later, the interruption of flight control systems, again in Sweden, that halted air traffic. Setting benchmarks to assess risks to critical infrastructure. Dickinson said the government is at a fundamental turning point in its approach to space weather planning and prepared to take decisive action to address this risk. Ralph Stoffler, the Director of Weather, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at U.S. Air Force Headquarters in Washington, said the Air Force was currently expanding its network of sensors to monitor space weather, including placing them on all of it into our daily lives. Such development will enable the solar terrestrial community to, for the first time, see a solar storm, track its approach, and prepare accordingly. That's the Daily Mail, but we're going to go to another source. Okay, so this is from Science Mag Org News, right? And that other one was from Physics News. Yeah, so this is Science Mag News. Okay. By Julia Joshin, July 14, 2016 at 2 p.m. Here's how the world could end and what we can do about it. She said that. In a dingy apartment building, insulated by layers of hanging rugs, the last family on Earth huddles around a fire, melting a pot of oxygen, ripped from the sun's warmth by a rogue dark star. The planet has been exiled to the cold outer reaches of the solar system. The lone clan of survivors might venture out into the endless night to harvest frozen atmospheric gases that have piled up like snow. As end of humanity scenarios go, that bleak vision from Fritz Leiber's 1951 short story, A Pail of Air, is a fairly remote possibility. Scholars who ponder such things think a self-induced catastrophic such as nuclear war or a bioengineered pandemic is most likely to do us in. However, a number of other extreme natural hazards, including threats from space and geological upheavals here on Earth, could still derail life as we know it, unraveling advanced civilization, wiping out billions of people, or potentially even exterminating our species. Nazan Martin Stojanevsky. Electrical surges due to a solar storm shocked telegraph operators in 1859. Today they could wreak havoc on power grids and electronics.